Now, what do you think the abolitionist movement did in 1788 upon the passage of the Regulation Act instead of the Abolition Act? What do you suppose they did? Did they celebrate it as a step in the right direction? Well, according to Greg Cunningham, Scott Klusendorf, Samuel Say, Seth Gruber, Mark Harrington, and on and on and on in the pro-life movement, they claim the abolition movement did, in fact, celebrate this regulation. Factually, obnoxiously false. We have need to be all on fire, for there are mountains of ice all around us to melt.
You're gonna escape hellfire!
Through a stage of development.
Challenge you with something. What is required based on your...
Just real quick, show of hands. How many of you, when attempting to convince someone to support a bill of total and immediate abolition, get told by a pro-lifer that they're like Wilberforce and they just want to take a step at a time? How many of you have ever experienced something like that? Like Wilberforce is actually brought up as a sort of champion or example of incrementalism. I find this to be very common and very annoying, primarily because William Wilberforce, I know the historical record, and a lot of pro-lifers have been pretty fast and loose. We'll get into it, but the general myth of the Wilberforce, what I would call the Wilberforce myth, is something along the lines of, hey, look, you guys are wanting to abolish abortion overnight in one fell swoop with a bill such as a bill that's been filed in a number of states so far, a bill to basically bring preborn human children under equal justice under the law, get equal protection, criminalize the murder of abortion murders by abortion without exception and from the moment of conception. Usually when you put that sort of thing forward, the pro-lifer tells you, well, we eventually want to get to that bill, but we're going to get there gradually. We're going to start, say, with banning abortion at maybe 20 weeks. Like we'll say at 20 weeks, right? At 20 weeks, abortion should be banned because the baby feels pain. And then we'll go back next session and say, well, actually, abortion should be banned at 15 weeks because the baby has a human-looking face. And then maybe 6 to 8 weeks because the baby has detectable heartbeat. And so they want to give you these sort of increments. And then maybe there's sort of like bills that are like banning abortion at a certain stage, but then allowing it for some exceptions. Like, let's allow it for rape, and then we'll go back next year with our smash mouths, and we'll ban it for rape too. So they come up with all these different bills to kind of incrementally do away with abortion instead of abolition. So it's been pretty common in our movement to kind of contrast abolition and incrementalism. The problem is, half the time, maybe even more, when you're dealing with someone that's saying something along the lines of, well, I want to be like Wilberforce, and Wilberforce didn't do it overnight. It took him 20 years. They're thinking the fact that it took him 20 years was incrementalism. And that something takes time isn't a problem. That you might see it come into being incrementally isn't exactly the problem. The problem is what is in your bill, like what you're writing in the language of your bill. Are you calling for the total immediate abolition of abortion every single year, and over time you convert more and more legislators to the cause, the people get more and more in agreement with it, and after 20 years of putting forward a bill of abolition, it passes. Is that incrementalism? No. That's total and immediate abolition constantly for 20 years. But, each of those days you have to put your pants on and go to work. So that was incrementalism. So it gets a little confusing, incrementalism and abolitionism, but the pro-life movement likes to use the word incrementalism. Incrementalism is code for regulationism. Okay? I'm starting it out like this way so I don't have to go through it, but regulationism is a bill that's written to regulate how abortions are done, when they're going to be done, what instruments can be used, what kind of justifications, what kind of story do you have to tell to abort the baby. And if you meet the regulations, you can have the abortion. So I think that just as a movement, since we're all kind of here, not all of us are here, but a lot of us are here, and we can take this back, I think we actually need to shift away from abolitionism versus incrementalism to abolitionism versus regulationism. I think that's just a rhetorical truth that I think that we need to do, because I think incrementalism is confusing for some people. The abolitionists, and I've been doing these kind of presentations for quite some time, and usually when you're talking to a crowd, like say even 8, 9, 10 years ago, anytime you got up and said, I'm going to give a talk on abolition, there would be a certain number of people there that are like, this guy's going to talk about the abolition of slavery? Like, isn't that what an abolitionist is? And of course, we just mean the word abolitionist to refer to people who are trying to abolish something, turn a bad law away, abolish a bad law, establish justice. But abolitionist, usually, you think of the abolitionist, you're going to think of either the abolitionists of chattel slavery in America, or probably more likely, you're going to think of sort of the abolitionists that are the most famous, the most heralded and loved, and they got movies made of them. And there's certainly a much more of a positive story to do with them, because in Britain, where they set themselves to abolish the slave trade and then abolish chattel slavery in their colonies, the abolitionists of the slave trade are who I'm going to be focusing on minutely in order to discuss kind of the differences between regulationism and abolitionism, and hopefully make a very ironclad case that the primary thing that keeps something from being abolished is choosing to regulate it instead. Not talking about these guys we talked about earlier in chattel slavery in America. We're talking about the abolitionists that abolished the slave trade. Now, what the slave trade was there's transatlantic slave trade. Essentially, the folks living in Africa, all the warring tribes, figured out that one of the things that they could do to gain money and empire and in trade with foreign nations was actually to go to war with one another, enslave different tribes, and then sell them to slave traders who would then take them from the African coast and work them to death in the sugar mines and in the cotton fields in the British colonies and everywhere else, basically. And the abolitionists of the slave trade were looking at this, the British abolitionists were looking at this from the perspective of Britain, where slavery was illegal, right? I'm not going to go into it, so we just start here. But slavery, the act of owning a slave, was not permitted in Britain. Right? It could happen in the colonies, but not in Britain. Due to English common law and the Somerset case and some other cases, prior to this period, they had already found and established in their courts that any human being this is so British, who breathes British air and steps on British soil is free. That's what it was like in Britain. The problem is part of Britain's economic superiority and empire building throughout this period from really 15th through the 19th century was predicated and built upon their their naval prowess and their ability to traffic millions of souls in the transatlantic slave trade. That's picking up slaves on the African coast and then taking them and selling them in the colonies to plantation owners and runners that were providing all the sugar. Because, British people love their tea, and you can't have tea without sugar. They love their rum. You can't have that. So the slaves, though you couldn't have slaves in Britain, you could have the financial benefits of slavery. So the abolitionists of the slave trade were a group of men who, it's very simple. The Marxists are always looking for some kind of reason. At the height of the economic superiority of the British Empire, somehow among the Brits, there were these Christians who said, I don't think that we should be doing this. They weren't seeing the slaves. They weren't walking by the auction blocks. They would hear about it, and what they would hear is that it was generally good and that the slaves liked it. Well, as reports started coming in about the number of slaves dying on the ships, unhappy conditions, Christians in Parliament and Christians in the ministry and just regular folks in Britain began to think, this is wrong, we need to do something about it. This is from Thomas Clarkson's History of the Rise, Progress, and Accomplishment of the Abolition of the British Slave Trade by Parliament. And he writes there in the opening pages that there's always been in all times and countries a counteracting energy which has opposed itself to the crimes and miseries of mankind. But it seems to be in reserve for Christianity to increase this energy and to give it the widest possible domain, to cut off many of the causes of wretchedness and to heal it wherever it is found. So there's something about Christians that look at oppression and wretchedness and they want to fix it. Well, that makes sense. Christians, we're to love our neighbors as ourselves and love God, and God commands us from the beginning to the end of his book to establish justice and equal protection and love our neighbors. So the abolitionists turn out to be just quite simply, and this isn't my definition, this is Thomas Clarkson, the first historian of abolition, the abolition of the trade. It literally, as simple as this is, that's what an abolitionist is. It was a Christian who rose up to remove evils. He says it's abolitionist, it's someone who wants to remove evils. And he says, and for whatever reason, the only ones that really seemed to want to do that were the Christians. So, Christians who rose up to remove evils. Thomas Clarkson there on the right, William Wilberforce there on the left. Wilberforce got involved as the head of the parliamentary practice, and at the height of the slave trade campaign, the abolition of the slave trade campaign, he did not write a treatise on how, black people are humans or persons and all this kind of stuff. He knew that was part of the argument, but he thought the real reason that we're not able to abolish this thing is we have a very defective view of Christianity. We have a very selfish culture. We're very much into just our parties and our soirees and our gowns and our tea and our rum and all this kind of thing. He said, we don't care because we are not loving our neighbors as ourselves and our God who made them, and we don't care about injustice. And so instead of writing a treatise on slavery and how to abolish it at the height of this thing, he actually writes a book that he thinks will actually be a means to abolish the slave trade. And it doesn't have anything to do with the slave trade. It gets mentioned once or twice kind of in the context, but it's a book called A Practical View of the Prevailing Religious System of Professed Christians in the Higher and Middle Classes in this Country, contrasted with real Christianity. And so what Wilberforce zeroes in on is we can't abolish the slave trade because we're not real Christians. If we were real Christians, we would not even participate in this kind of human trafficking. So he compares professed Christians, all talk, no life Christians, nominal Christians, Sunday Christians, to real Christians when they see the slave trade want to abolish it. Well, Christians who rise up to remove evils that are real. So the abolitionists set themselves to this work, and it begins with a small society of men who get together. They're well-to-do men. They're leaders in societies. Some are ministers, some are bankers, some are artists, statesmen who say we need to form a society for effecting the abolition of the slave trade. At this point in history, they did not have a legislator, a parliamentarian. They did not have any support from the crown. They had no support. They just knew they needed to do something about it. Granville Sharp, the father of British abolitionism, basically, he was the one who had successfully argued that slavery in Britain was against common law and that it should be nowhere legal in Britain in the Somerset or Stuart case. He also argued that the reason that we're going to say slavery is not legal in Britain isn't going to be, we're not going to beat around this bush. We're going to literally say, because it's contrary to the higher law of God. All right, it's a better time, I hate to say a better country, but that's how they roll. They're like, we do not want to do things in our nation that are contrary to the higher law of God. That's why they didn't have slavery. So why in the world are they participating in the slave trade? So, as slavery is absolutely inconsistent with Christianity, because we cannot say of any slaveholder that he doth not do to another what he would not have done to himself. That is the golden rule, loving your neighbor as yourself, the royal law of liberty, because no slave trader himself would want to be a slave being traded. This is something that ought to be immediately abolished because of Christianity. Opposing injustices such as slavery were commanded by God, and abolition became a moral imperative, ethical obligation, and a mark of fidelity to the divine will. So it was an opportunity for these men to show that they were Christians, to put on display their salt and their light, and to love neighbors, most of whom they had not even seen. Maybe pictures, and they've read reports, propaganda about the trade. But as they came to understand its wickedness, they said, we are going to do something about this. So they form a committee. It's made up of a number of different men on the actual committee. They also enlist in their movement some former slaves that escaped from the life of slavery, who write books to popularize the idea, to basically correct the misinformation. For about 100 or so years, Britain is participating in the transatlantic slave trade and telling everybody back home that they're doing a favor for Africa. Well, as slaves like Equiano and others begin publishing works explaining what it was like to be ripped from their home, put on a ship, and taken to a colony to be worked to death, this is whenever the abolition of slavery in the British colonies becomes something of concern. The problem is that it's really wrapped up in all this sort of colonial law. It's like, and you got to understand, this is kind of a boring point, but you got to understand that British Parliament could pass various laws having to do with the colonies, but a lot of the colonies had their own governors, their own laws, all this kind of stuff, and it was a big mess. So the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, not yet knowing and understanding exactly what was going on, they had a debate. At the very beginning of their sort of meeting, they had a debate, and are we going to abolish the slave trade? Are we going to abolish slavery? Under the information that they were given, the idea was that the slaves were in danger of death, usually from disease, dysentery, suicide, various maladies that happen on a slave ship. And that once they got to the colonies, they were given housing and basically set up and given jobs and all this kind of stuff, and that they were well taken care of. That's what the plantations were telling them. But the slave trade, which they were getting information about, was full of death and mistreatment of people, piling people on top of people. You would start out a ship with, say, 600 slaves, and whenever you came into port, you'd have like 400. That's how many you lost. You were feeding the sharks all across the Atlantic Ocean. And as they found this out, they said, what we need to do is what we can do. They felt bound to do the slave trade, and so that's what they decided to do. I'm not saying they were perfectly right on that, but I am saying, looking at the true history of the abolition of the slave trade, that's how it starts. This is how it ends. In 1807, the Slave Trade Act is passed. This is 1807 Slave Trade Act, that from and after the first day of May 1807, the African slave trade and all manner of dealing and trading in the purchase, sale, barter, or transfer of slaves or of persons intended to be sold, transferred, used, or dealt with as slaves, practiced or carried on in at to or from any part of the coast or countries of Africa shall be, and the same is hereby utterly abolished, prohibited, and declared to be unlawful. So the Slave Trade Act that was passed that criminalized British involvement in the slave trade came through in a single bill in 1807 called the Slave Trade Act. Well, how did we get there? 12 to 13 million is what we estimate African men, women, children captured and transported, enslaved to become chattel. In the process, 10 to 20% of them perished in the Middle Passage. So there's tons of death. I don't know how apocryphal it is, but there was generally lots of just throwing slaves overboard. It's said that lots of ships' logs track that the sharks followed the ships from the African coast to the Americas because they were being consistently fed. Because a slave that got sick is going to get another slave sick, and that's hurting your profit. So throw them overboard. There was all manner of that kind of inhuman treatment on the trade. And then whenever they got to the plantations, they were worked to death there as well. Now, when certain pastors, this is Richard Baxter, who I'm a big fan of. If you haven't read Richard Baxter, you should. He's a wonderful theologian and pastor. But he was one of the early, very strong abolitionists. Total, immediate abolition for the glory of God. He thought slave trade, slavery, the whole thing is just rebellion against God. It's basically the dominion of man over man. It's like man becoming God over other men. And that the only people who would do it are people that would be in rebellion against God. I gotta balance my Calvinist and my Wesleyans. Wesley was also very strong on the slave trade being the execrable sum of villainies. That's awesome. So John Wesley, very ardent, wrote tracts, tried to rouse people to be aware of this inhumanity that was going on and try to form some kind of an abolitionist movement among those who were following his teachings. At the time, and this is just a quote, the reason I put up some quotes from like historians, these are secondary scholars who, it's not to say, well, you have to read everything, but the more you read, the better. But sometimes you got to kind of like read to people and just listen to what they're saying. So everything I'm saying is more than just a few quotes. But while anti-slavery ideology received contributions from across the wide spectrum of 18th century intellectual life, the sphere of religion constituted the most important source. And that's going to be what atheist and agnostic secular historians do. They actually find it to be kind of a mystery. They don't understand why the British Christians rose up when they did to abolish the slave trade in the way they did for the reasons they did, but they kind of basically say it might be one of the purely benevolent acts in history that doesn't seem to have had an economic benefit, but a grave economic cost, and that the reasons that they gave for why they were doing what they were doing were explicitly religious, and that mattered at this time. So that's just background context. So, long story short here, Wilberforce is how many of y'all seen the movie Amazing Grace? Is that still a popular movie? That's kind of an okay movie. It's a little wonky in some areas, but it's a very entertaining picture of the whole story. There's some historical problems in it, like all movies that are adapted. But in that movie, it's relatively accurate that Wilberforce may have had a nominal Christian upbringing with some Christian influence here and there, but was not born again. He did not believe in Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord in a personal way as a child, had some kind of influence, but it really wasn't, and he was born, this is like a silver spoon in his mouth. He is born wealthy. He's expected to be someone. He's very talented, best tutors, best schooling. He's basically been born to be a lord, right? House of Parliament, man, potentially Prime Minister of Britain. And he grows up, living this sort of playboy politician life, gets elected to Parliament, is very popular. He's loved at parties. He's a gambler and he's doing all the things that you shouldn't do, but he's living for himself. And in the recess of one of the parliamentary sessions, after he had been there for just a little bit, he went on a coach ride. Sounds kind of fun. Got on a coach ride with the Lucasian professor of mathematics at Cambridge, who was just another well-to-do gentleman. And that's what they'd do. They'd go on these coach rides throughout the country, and they would talk and, I don't know, just enjoy each other's intellect or whatever. But this guy was actually a hardcore, sold-out follower of Jesus Christ and evangelized Wilberforce, gave him Philip Doddridge's book, if you've ever read his book on Christianity. And Wilberforce, in the throes of this situation, read Doddridge, had these debates, found himself, like so many of us, probably in his room reading the New Testament and realizing, woe is me, I'm undone. I need to give my life to you, Christ. I am a sinner. Save me. And this is what happened in Wilberforce's life. The story is there's more detail, but essentially, after he gave his life to Christ, he was faced with this situation. He didn't really feel like he was doing anything for God. He felt like he was just living for himself. He knew that he was. And his first inclination was to leave Parliament. He's going to leave Parliament, and he was going to join the ministry. I'm a Christian. I'm going to go be a minister. Well, he had some minister friends that were like, no, you're in Parliament. You're already there. Why don't you do some good while you're there? And so John Newton, the author of Amazing Grace, and William Pitt, his friend and fellow parliamentarian, said, no, don't leave, stay, and just do something for God in Parliament. So Wilberforce struggles. What do I want to do for God? And God gives him two great objects. He says, the abolition of the slave trade, because he's been reading about this, and the reformation of manners, the reformation of good morals in society, because society had declined quite a bit during his period. So Wilberforce stays in Parliament, and upon coming back, now an evangelical Christian, very enthusiastic for his faith, he decides to start meeting with abolitionists. Abolitionists themselves, this is a providence of God story. Wilberforce is over here getting saved by a math professor. And Thomas Clarkson is over here writing essays about the evils of the slave trade and sneaking onto ships and documenting the brutality, writing pamphlets and gathering up men and meeting with Sharp and that committee. Well, that committee finds out that Wilberforce has given his life to Christ, and they immediately think, we've got someone to carry a bill to abolish the slave trade. So they reach out to him, they convince him to carry a bill to abolish the slave trade. And like we all do, like every one of you probably has in some way tried to get a legislator, if you've been around the movement for a while, gone and talked to a legislator to try to convince them to sponsor a bill of abolition. Quite difficult. Well, when they met with Wilberforce, there was a little bit of hesitancy on his part, but not for very long. God had gotten a hold of him. So that's about all the background we can do. But what we are going to look at, welcome to history class, is Wilberforce's 20-year campaign to abolish the slave trade. Let's examine it in some detail. 1787, he's back. It is abolished in 1807. 1787, William Wilberforce comes and he says, he's told Sharp and Clarkson, I will accept political leadership of the campaign and I will put together a bill of abolition to suppress the slave trade. So he's committed. You see this in his journal. You see this in his letters. Basically, God's got a hold of him. So he informs Pitt immediately of his intention to move for total abolition of the slave trade. Pitt is in line to be the prime minister. He's the most popular, well-liked fellow there in Parliament. And Wilberforce convinced young William Pitt to also be in favor of abolition. So this is from the get-go looking pretty good. Well, first thing that happens, first year that public announcement of a bill to abolish the slave trade is put forward, what is the immediate response from British Parliament? Well, Sir William Dalton stands up and he proposes a bill to regulate the slave trade. Yeah, that's good. So this guy over here, I agree, slave trade is bad because of how many people die. So why don't we just clean up the ships? give more space. So you imagine it's a bill that says instead of 3 by 5 feet, we're going to give them 4 by 6 feet to each slave or something like that. Let's regulate it. Let's make it clean. Let's check them. Let's regulate it. The abolition idea is kind of, let's do this instead. All right. So the pattern begins. That's the actual language there, or the actual suggestion. Shipping 6 men per 3 tons, we should limit it to 5. So giving them more space. And so the Earl of Carlisle, it's a first step in the right direction. Other ones are known to have said, hooray, hear, hear, and huzzah, because that's how these people speak. If there are quotes around it, it's actually from a source. If they're not, it's just funny. So the regulation bill, so you've got Wilberforce back. He's been converted. He's ready to do his part. Hey, let's abolish the slave trade. It's evil. And God's going to judge our nation. Let's do this. Come on. And Pitt's like, yeah, let's do this. And then Parliament's like, actually, let's regulate it instead. Okay? And what do? They pass it, they change the tonnage, and they celebrate it as a triumph. Now, what do you think the abolitionist movement did in 1788 upon the passage of the Regulation Act instead of the Abolition Act? What do you suppose they did? Did they celebrate it as a step in the right direction? Well, according to Greg Cunningham, Scott Klusendorf, Samuel Say, Seth Gruber, Mark Harrington, and on and on and on in the pro-life movement, they claim the abolition movement did, in fact, celebrate this regulation. Factually, obnoxiously false. Immediately upon the passage of the Regulation Act, Thomas Clarkson penned an essay on the comparative efficiency of regulation or abolition. So we're literally talking at the very beginning of the very first abolition movement, at the very first proposal of something other than abolition. The abolitionists freak out and pass out pamphlets opposing the step in the right direction. In this work, he writes, upon the whole, it appears that any regulating bill, even of the wisest kind, that little F thing is the way S's used to look. You see that? Wisest kind, could never remove the evils of the first class, inasmuch as it could never be applied, that with respect to those of the second, among which is the parent and foundation of the rest, it could never operate at all. I probably shouldn't even read this. I'll read the part that's really relevant because it probably sounds a little bit like gobbledygook. But he says, it would be a political evil. Passing a bill to regulate the slave trade, it would be a political evil inasmuch as it would prevent a variety of good. Wilberforce says, let's do this good thing. No, let's regulate it instead. We could do this, but let's do this instead. So it becomes a political evil. Passes this out. A bill of abolition only could be effectual, which would come in like a saving arm, which would destroy the many-headed monster at once. Does this sound kind of like us? Here we have it in 1788, responding to the first abolition objection with regulation. Clarkson, the leading writer, it's probably the leading popularizer. In the movie, it's Rufus Sewell, and he's like always on the horse, if you remember Amazing Grace. So, manners of both countries could be productive of great political good. So immediately, he says, this will never remove it. Regulation is a way to keep it legal, and only abolition. They publish, they have this drawn up, and they publish it. It's a very famous it's pretty much the first known piece of hardcore political propaganda that was printed in mass and distributed in a country. A lot of people, pro-lifers, I remember Greg Cunningham, when I was debating him, brought this up as an example of a late 18th century graphic image. It was a graphic image, but you know what it actually is? It's an anti-pro-life regulation image. If you look at the top, it says, stowage of the British slave Brooks under the regulated slave trade. This is what slaves look like after they improved the conditions, right? They're piled on top of each other, but this is the improvement. It's because everyone was running around saying, well, every step counts. Let's take the steps. They also created the Emma, not a man and a brother symbol. It was Wedgwood, part of the society, to basically get Christians to be moved to care about these slaves. The reason they put that out there is because they did not want to be satisfied with regulation. So Wilberforce wasn't able to put a bill forward in 1788 because this other bill was put in its place. But in 1789, he wasn't happy with regulation, so he went back. He made his first full-length speech on abolition, 1789. It's published. It is a masterful work. In it, he explains why he's going to abolish it, for who and by what means. And he says that he'll be able to justify upon every clear principle, every resolution in his hand, which is the resolution to abolish the slave trade. And he calls for, in his first speech, this is his first speech, quote, the total abolition of the slave trade, not the partial, not some ships, all ships. And he claims that we have to abolish it because we are all guilty. We ought to plead guilty, not exculpate ourselves by throwing the blame on others. And then he reasons that he deprecates every kind of reflection against the various descriptions of people who are more immediately involved in this wretched business, which was, there was a lot of talk about, like, maybe we will, some people are more guilty than others. He just was saying, no, we are all guilty. This is our lot. We represent the people, and the people, we should be able to abolish this. So the principle upon which that he was going to base his entire campaign was not on policy, but justice, right? He was not making an argument that we should abolish the slave trade because it will benefit us financially, because it would not. But we should do it for justice. He had become a Christian, and it's very hard to get around those biblical passages that present a principle that is above everything that is political. And when I reflect on the command, this is on the House of Parliament floor, thou shalt do no murder, believing its authority to be divine, how can I dare to set up any reasonings of my own against it? God said, thou shalt not murder. This is a murderous act. How would I be in my right to regulate this, to do anything but thou shalt not murder? It will appear from everything, first speech, which I have said, that it is not regulation, it is not mere palliatives that can cure this enormous evil. Total abolition is the only possible cure for it. Total abolition, not regulation. He trusts that he's made his case, that abolition should take place. People clap. They had just passed the regulation bill in the name of humanity, but here Wilberforce is not a fan of the regulation bill, presenting a bill to abolish it. So he was determined from this point, this is 1789, that he would never rest till he had effected its abolition. So he makes the speech. They're gauging support for the bill, and he puts forward the bill. The way they do these sometimes is you kind of propose it, and then the prime minister says, yeah, it's a bit of a different system in Britain, but he's able to put forward the bill for total abolition in 1791. It goes up for a vote, and it is defeated April 20th. It is defeated by the Christian Parliament of Britain. Why? Because a majority of these men are making their lives and getting their support from people who are benefiting immensely from the slave trade. They'll regulate it, but they will not abolish it. The vote was 163 to 88, 75 against. I have to do that because I could not do the math without that. So 1792, Wilberforce goes back, identical bill calling for the total abolition of the slave trade. This time when he puts it forward, it gets amended and defeated. Someone amends it by putting forward the following motion. This is you can read this, it's on Google Books. It's actually kind of a rousing read if you can read the kind of older English. When the bill of abolition is put forward this time, a parliamentary member named Henry Dundas stands up and he says, I agree with Wilberforce and share the goal of abolishing the slave trade. I agree. Everyone claps. Oh, at least all the abolitionists that not the 75 who voted against it. But Dundas says he's a very powerful member. He's in line to become even higher ranking lord, but he's stand up and he says, I agree, we must abolish the slave trade. But he amends it with this word, but it must be abolished gradually. The way he says it in that movie. They did get that right in the movie. The Right Honorable Henry Dundas, conceiving that some misconception may perhaps arise from my voting with my honorable friend in his motion as it is now stands, I rise to move an amendment to it, which is to insert the word gradually before the words to be abolished. This motion will then be that the slave trade ought gradually to be abolished. Okay, add the word gradual to it, and how does the bill fare? Well, it, gets defeated. So he added this, said we should vote on it, didn't work. 1793 moves for abolition again, it's defeated. 1794, there's no abolition bill. There's not really many bills at all, because in 1794 to 1790, the area there with those lines, Britain's at war with France, and there's just a lot going on. 1795, the motion reminding Parliament of Dundas, sorry, I'm going so fast because I don't want to go over time. But in 1792, whenever the bill was put forward, Dundas argued that when they said, well, what do you mean by gradually, by when? And he suggested that we would do it by so 1796, he's put forward this motion. He said, hey, remember Dundas said that we could abolish it by 1796. Well, 1796 comes along. Wilberforce brings a bill for total and immediate abolition, and it's defeated 74 to 70. It's getting close. So what was the holdout? What is it that a few men needed to see in order to pass the bill? How could Wilberforce modify his bill in such a way to maybe gain 5 to 10 votes? What does he do? He comes back in 1797 and he moves for total abolition. Same language. Total abolition is the policy for justice because it is wicked trade and inhumanity. And it's defeated 80-74. We've got a situation here where all of a sudden you're looking at Parliament and you're saying how many of us are abolitionists and how many of us are not. And so a lot of work is beginning to be done in the community. This is whenever you have all the petitioning, all the book writing, all the they were wearing am I not a man and brother symbols like the AHA symbol. That's where that came from. So lots of cultural work was being done to put pressure on Parliament. And lots of petitions were being sent to them. And this is when Wilberforce, did anyone watch the Tucker Carlson, Douglas Wilson interview? Did anyone watch that? Something Douglas Wilson said there that's actually very good and true. It just has to be balanced against not being an excuse to not take action. But the situation by 1797 looked to Wilberforce to be more than political, that there needed to be massive cultural change. And that's whenever he set himself to work. When he noticed this, that nominal Christianity was reigning in the country, he said, what we need to do is we need to get people more serious about Christ, and that will have an effect on Parliament, and Parliament will abolish the trade. So that's in 1797. 1798, he doesn't sort of take any time or waste or do anything else. He once again returns with a bill for total abolition, and this bill is defeated 87-83. So we're looking at similar defeats over time. 1799, what does he put forward? Bill for total abolition, defeated 84-54. And this happens. I don't know if we want to get supernatural or anything like this, but all hell breaks loose once again. Britain is going to be at war with the French. And through this period of 1800 to 1803, a massive blow to the abolition movement occurs. The argument is made that if Britain abolishes their participation in the slave trade, France will reap all the benefits. They will become a world empire. We will lose to them. We need to get you abolitionists to shut up. So this is the period in which the abolitionists are called a sect. This is before the word cult. They were considered a sect of do-gooders who were so interested in abolishing the slave trade that they were going to doom the whole country. And so much of culture and society was telling them, here, after so many years, you need to stop putting forward these bills. back to war with France, kind of shutters things. Wilberforce has a drug problem. I could put it a little softer than that. He's been prescribed opium. He's very sick. He's unwell. It's very unhealthy. There aren't any bills filed during this period. It's kind of the darkest time in the abolition campaign. But by 1804, a bunch of the abolitionists come back from kind of exile. They were treated as Jacobins and dangerous to society, and they were going to ruin the world. And Britain, we wouldn't even have a country if you guys keep on arguing we need the slave trade. It is our key. Well, that's no longer on the table. 1804, Wilberforce, actually with another set of guys that have come back, they start messing around with some stuff and move for abolition of the slave trade with any captured colony or foreign power. Now, this is a move that gets lionized in different accounts of this tale. It's not Wilberforce, but it is being put forward as a sort of, okay, let's see if what you're saying about the war in France is the reason that we're not going to abolish the slave trade. What if we just hurt the French or hurt other colonies or foreign powers with abolishing it there? That gets passed with a vote of 124 to 49. Now, historians debate this, why that was passed. Was it really just because of all the rhetoric about the war? When it actually comes down to it, but upon analysis, is that all of the Irish MPs that came in 1804, for those of y'all who know a lot of British history, you'll know what I'm saying, and the rest of you just, whatever, just take it with don't take it with a grain of salt, take it as hardcore fact. It was carried in the Commons. This particular bill didn't have the opposition, and they noticed, oh my gosh, all these new parliamentarian fellows from Ireland that have just been added to Royal Parliament, they're with us on this abolition stuff. And of course they would be, because Ireland was not part of the slave trade. They were not benefiting from it. So he passes this parliamentary bill forbidding trade with any captured colony or foreign power, but it does not abolish the slave trade. It does not abolish the slave trade. So Wilberforce, looking at it, these things that are being passed by, a son-in-law and, family members and other men that are putting forward bills to forbid this ship from entering the trade, regulating trade and all this kind of stuff. They're being put forward, they're passing, and they're having nothing to do. They're not abolishing the slave trade. They're just kind of messing around. 1806, May 23rd, this is whenever Wilberforce begins to write the following letter on the abolition of the slave trade. 1807, he writes this book and he comes out with it. And you would think that the letter on the abolition of the slave trade is being written at such a time as this for one reason and one reason alone. It's because Wilberforce now knows that he has all the votes. The letter is to his people that elected him, have kept him there in office this entire time. He's essentially writing them to say, we cannot regulate this out of existence. We cannot do anything. The only way to do this is to totally and immediately abolish the slave trade. And so in 1807, the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act is put forward. The language is essentially identical to the 1789 speech and 1791 language, but it's got the author of William Grenville on it. Wilberforce lets someone else take the name. It passes the Lords 100 to 34. There's a long debate in the House of Commons, but it's just a formality because when it gets to the Commons, it passes 283 to 16. So February 23rd is when the Abolition Act is read and Parliament comes to their feet. Standing ovation for William Wilberforce. Good job for this 20-year campaign, and he abolished it. He doesn't care much for the fanfare or anything, but he is rumored to have said, Spurgeon actually talks about this, but he's rumored to, where this story comes from, is that whenever they abolished the slave trade, William Wilberforce's immediate response was, well, surely there's something else for us to abolish, right? Which is kind of a lesson in that abolition is not necessarily connected to slavery or the slave trade. It's just abolition. So that's what we do. In his letter, Wilberforce writes, and again, this came out before the act, Let me most seriously urge, this is at the end, this is 19 years in. Wilberforce is reflecting back on his entire campaign. He knows that they're about to pull this off. They've got the votes, they're aware. Next time he puts it forward, it's passing. Let me most seriously urge on the conscientious deliberations of those who, by their fatal proposal of gradual instead of immediate abolition, dashed the cup of happiness from the lips of the wretched African. At the very moment when at last he appeared likely to taste it, and who thus proved in fact the most efficient supporters of the slave trade, a vast majority in Parliament were then so much alive to the principles of justice and humanity that all direct opposition would have been utterly ineffectual. But this kind of half measure, however unintentionally, exactly answered the purpose of our enemies by giving time for the zeal of men to cool, providing an expedient by which, aided by a little of that self-deception which we are all apt to practice on ourselves on suitable occasions, they might feel the complacencies arising from an act of justice and humanity without paying the price or making the sacrifice which those principles required. It's flowery language. It's a little hard to, when I'm just reading it. But he's talking all the way back at the beginning. We could have done this 20 years ago. But at the moment when we were prone to do it, half measures were put forward instead. Gradualism was adopted instead, and we dashed the cup of happiness from the lips of their Africans. Fatal proposal of gradual instead of immediate abolition. Now, Wilberforce is using gradual here to refer to all those increments and all that gradualism. But he's setting up what abolitionists from this point forward learn, that the enemy to abolition is gradualism and regulation, because it's put forward as a substitute. And it's a hardcore book. So for Greg Cunningham and Scott Klusendorf and all those guys that talk about Wilberforce as this champion of gradualism, in his book he comes out and you know what he said? You know who he says is most responsible for keeping the slave trade from being abolished? Not the pro-slavers, not the slave traders, but the gradualists. They were the ones who proved, in fact, the most efficient supporters of the slave trade, even unintentionally. So if you go back and you look at it, Wilberforce says, we must not forget the bounty of providence or the day of retribution, and vowing never, never will we desist till we have released ourselves from the load of guilt. Wilberforce is standing there in 1791 saying, we have to abolish this because a day of retribution is coming. On the House floor, he is talking about the judgment of God coming if they delay justice. But at this time, and at all times, the proverb is true that righteousness exalteth a nation, and that natural crimes bring national punishments. Abolitionists were troubled by the fear that God would chastise an impenitent Britain for trading in African slaves. They were buoyed by the hope that repentance could restore divine favor. In the process of their failure to repent and the judgment of God, killed many men, as many as the Civil War, right? It was a disgrace. It was the end of their dominance. It was the end of their power, the loss of their colony, and the birth of America. And the judgment was that slavery would continue in the United States of America. So the failure on the part of the British to stand up and abolish it before Almighty God, to forestall his wrath and his judgment against national sins, was not as accomplished as we sometimes see. There was judgment, there was death, and because of the decision to deal with it in pieces, once they accomplished the abolition of the slave trade, the abolition of slavery remained a curse upon the young United States nation. So, in conclusion, I've probably gone over, I don't even know, it's 3:14. In conclusion, when pro-lifers are approached with abolishing abortion, and we stand before them and we do say that one of the reasons we are doing what we are doing is for the glory of God and to forestall his wrath and his judgment. This is deadly serious stuff. The pro-lifer who puts forward a bill, I agree with you that it should be abolished, but it should be done gradually, is inviting the judgment of God, is inviting war and death and pestilence and whatever we would deserve. Because this whole time in the United States of America, just like this whole time in Britain, the means by which we could abolish such an iniquitous practice have always been within our grasp. There's never been a time in which we could not, that it was literally, you could not abolish something like the slave trade or slavery or abortion, has never not been within our grasp. And the primary enemy in every abolition campaign, whether you're talking about theirs or ours, is not the pro-slavery person. It's not the pro-abortion person. It's the pro-regulation, pro-gradualism person. And that's why the abolition movement spends more time fighting with pro-lifers than pro-choicers. I'll end it there.